colleagues here on the call. As Lucy said, if you want to interact with us, please use the chat function. So you can, I've already seen an exchange of numbers going on. So Peter and Alain, just in case you need each other's phone numbers, I can help out on this one as well. But in general, so any questions you have, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we will try to answer them as we go along. Some of you might have seen Alice and myself before. We were running a webinar about 6 months ago on the future of boards. So it's a true pleasure also today to have Alain, who joined us recently from Singapore, where he has ample experience, decades of experience, I can say, in the board space across Singapore, the Asian region, and before that in Europe. And we'll bring another international perspective. I think just for following the same format also that we were running last time, we'll try to have a healthy mix today between what we see internationally, globally, so what is best practice, state of the art, what kind of trends do we see when it comes to board dynamics. At the same time, we'll also give a regional picture. Where are we potentially doing well as a region? Where do we need to catch up, and what are particular elements to focus on going forward? So can we run the slides, please? Just, there we go. Thank you, Alice. If you go to slide 4. So in terms of our objectives of today, I think it's pretty simple what we want to achieve. On the one hand, we want to get a better understanding for all of you of the importance of good board dynamics. So what is it that we are talking about when we talk about board dynamics? Why is it so important? And also, how do we even measure it? It's a bit of an abstract concept, and it's not a black or white thing in many cases. So how do we really identify that our board has effective dynamics or potentially not, and how do we recognize that? And finally, we also want to make sure that we can help with some practical measures to improve the dynamics of your board. So what has worked in other cases? What are we doing? What do we see with our clients working well or not working well? We'll move on. You can find many definitions surely for effective board dynamics. So this one described by a very, very well-known chairman in the region who said preparation, participation, decision-making, implementation, and follow-up, or in other words, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What we hear also a lot when we talk to boards is about creating a healthy tension. So how do we make sure we have trust on the one hand side, but on the other also challenge each other? So, you know, this mix of being together, exchanging ideas and disagreeing at the same time to come to good conversations, good discussions, and conclude in something that's really valuable for the organization in a trusted environment with high quality team dynamics is very, very important for us. When we look at the lower part of the slide here, and just hold on for a second. Yeah, when we look at the lower part of the slide here, I think that's really interesting from a data perspective, because as I said, board dynamics is oftentimes difficult to measure. There were a number of studies done over the years, and I think the one that I personally find the most impressive one is one from Harvard Business School that was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2014, where they discovered a very, very high correlation of board dynamics or effective board dynamics and team dynamics and firm profitability. So there is clearly hard data available as well when you look at how are we performing as a board, how are we doing together as a team, and what our data tells us about the profitability, the success, the commercial success of the organization. And on top of that, if you dig deeper in terms of again, coming back to the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, there's a clear indication that functioning as an effective team is absolutely key for a board, and it's actually more important than have either one very well qualified director. In other words, you could have a team that has maybe not the most qualified directors, but they function extremely well together, and they will most likely produce a better outcome than a board of superstars who absolutely do not see eye to eye and do not work effectively as a team. So a piece of thought, making sure when you invest also in the composition of your board, not only who are the best people as individuals, but who are the best people that work together in the best possible way. Just a little bit more data on this one if we move on, Alice. The elements that we can see is around recognizing the importance of board dynamics is there is a trend here, and we can see it's not always going up. So we have different data points from different years, and we see that ineffective board practices is often seen as a big barrier for success of the organization. I'm not quite sure why 2015 was particularly high, but we can see somewhere, if I take a trend line here or I take an average, we're probably saying about a third, 30 to 35% averaging here in terms of organizations or board members, board directors who feel that board dynamics are important. On the other hand, when we look at the right-hand side, what is considered as board dynamics and the concept of evolving it and being effective as a board, it's often brought down to some of the kind of more tangible areas. Do we have good quality of minutes? Do we have a clear agenda? Is information shared? And yes, all of this is important, so don't get me wrong. Absolutely big supporter of great preparation, clear agenda, and all these kinds of things. Nevertheless, active participation, the way people work with each other, the dynamics that evolve through discussion, we would clearly see as equally, maybe in some cases, even more important than the hard facts. So the elements that are harder to measure are the ones that are probably sometimes even more important than the ones that are easier to measure and easier to run as well for the board secretary. Let's not forget, board dynamics do evolve within the board, and they are more difficult to influence than, for example, the meetings, the agenda, or other elements that can be prepared upfront. If we continue, what we also see that board dynamics as a concept, and on the left-hand side, you see the year 2009 from the BDI survey, and on the right-hand side, you see the year 2019, where people were asked what are the most important three barriers, the top three barriers for board effectiveness in the GCC. And you can see that board dynamics has come down in the hierarchy. So we see board composition and director capabilities even increasing also percentage-wise. But when we look down afterwards, there are not a lot of elements that came in. I mean, we can see also overall the bars were rising, which is, I think, a function of boards becoming more mature. Also thanks to the BDI for doing a great work of professionalizing the boardroom, I would say, in the region, offering great training, having more qualification, offering more qualifications for board members. So we see people are more cognizant of potential issues, but we also see that board dynamics have actually gone down in how important individuals see it versus other inhibitors to effective board performance. And while we believe that's a dynamic that is, again, driven by structural elements being probably easier to recognize and easier to resolve, we also think this is potentially a risky dynamic that we see in the region, as a lot of the boards that are working here do depend on great board dynamics to have really productive outcomes. So something to watch for the future, and clearly something that a lot of boards have also recognized as being important and are working on at this point in time. So quick overview before I hand over to Alice. How do we define healthy board dynamics, and what does it mean for us? And as I said, there are different definitions, so please feel free to go with whatever you think makes most sense. This is something we have created out of hundreds or probably even thousands of clients that we have worked with in the board space over the last decade, just to make sure that we capture all the dimensions in the board dynamic space. On the one hand side, we see the board purpose and role. I mean, purposeful management, a big topic for many organizations, in particular in a crisis situation. COVID has propelled and excelled the work around purpose in organizations a lot, and the importance of purpose. So is the board clear about its purpose? So what does it stand for? What is it that only this board can do? Are the priorities clear? So are the shareholders clear on the priorities? And does the board really embrace those, as well as does the board also make sure that the executives embrace the priorities? And this is something long-term. Oftentimes boards struggle with the short-term objectives of the organization and the long-term perspective that they need to take, especially when you have quarterly reportings and quarterly targets. So very, very important to have longevity in this planning process. Second area here, board composition, heavily discussed at this point in time. Do we have the right mix of diverse talent? And I'm not only talking about gender diversity. Just an example, I'm working with a board in India at the moment, and it was a very interesting scenario where actually the chairman of the NRC said, look, we've expanded substantially internationally, a major multi-billion-dollar conglomerate across different industries. So we've expanded internationally. Our client base is becoming younger and younger. And then I look at our board, and we have 9 out of 10 members are 55-plus-year-old Indian gentlemen. So are we representing what the issues are that the organization is facing or will be facing over the future? No, we are not. So we need to do something about it. So it's really making sure that we have the right mix of diversity, as well as hire and onboard new board members effectively. Onboarding still something that hardly happens. Most organizations that I work with, when you ask a new board member, what kind of onboarding did you get? You can look at you with a blank stare, pretty much. So it's like, yeah, I was given access to previous board meetings potentially, and I have a strategy paper about the organization. That's it. So make sure that people can work effectively. And finally, last but not least, even deeper dive into the dynamics and the governance structure. What's the balance of power in the boardroom? We'll speak a lot about that, the role of the chairman. We'll speak about decision rights, as well as what is the trust element in there, how are we challenging each other, and what's the level of inclusion that we see within the board. So that's just a quick overview of what we are planning to do in the next about 70 minutes. And I'll hand over for a quick poll, I think, first, to get some of your opinions. If you can start the first question. So if you just answer, please, which country do you currently work in? We're just trying to get a quick overview of geographically where our client base comes from. And then if you're currently serving as a board member. And your board experience as well, what are the main factors? Okay, please do join into our polling sessions. We only have 10 replies now out of 70. Yeah, increasing quickly now. Okay. Good. Being conscious of time, should we close the polling? So we can see majority of our participants are coming from Saudi Arabia. And great to see the majority of our participants are also currently serving as board members and have been with boards for quite a long period of time in privately held organizations. Most interesting probably for us, question number 5. What are the current main factors of driving healthy board dynamics? Pretty much a tie between the role of the chair, diversity of the board, and the governance processes. The role of the chair and diversity of the board, something we'll talk about a little bit later, as two of the key elements. So I'm glad to see that what I expected in terms of the answers from our own experience, not only in the region, but globally, is also reflected in our answers here. If you have additional comments, as we said, please put them into the chat. In particular, if there's something that you would like to know or get out of this session today. So if there are particular topics, particular questions you would like to have answered, then we will be happy to do so. Please put them into the chat window, and we'll weave them in as we go along. With that said, thank you very much for running the poll, Lucy and Vandana. I'll hand over to Alice to give us more of a global perspective on where boards are at this point in time and the purpose and the role of boards.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Marcus, and thank you, Lucy, and to the GCC BDI for having us here today. We're delighted to be with you all. So, as Marcus said, we're using this frame really for the rest of our time together, and I'm going to lead us through the first two pieces of this: the purpose and role, and the composition sections. We'll share a little bit of our thinking, and very much open it up for you all, as we have done so far, with some polls and questions to get some feedback and input on what your reactions and thoughts are as well. So for the first piece on purpose and role, it's really, as it says here, is the board clear on its purpose, aligned on near and long-term priorities, and making decisions now and for the future. And we think, this is a big topic when you think about board dynamics, that boards that we work with globally very often have this at the heart of what may be going on in terms of the board and its effectiveness and dynamics on the board. So we wanted to share a few things on this topic for you. So the first thought we had, and something that we find really helpful with our clients and the boards that we serve, is before we get into this topic of dynamics, where we do often see, as Marcus was sharing in the data, clients, boards go to the meeting rhythms, the minutes, the agendas, the conversation that's happening in the boardroom, and think about that in terms of dynamics. Are we talking about the right things? Are we having the right amount of time on things? How are the relationships on the board? All of that is important, and we will come to that in this conversation. But we usually find, and I've worked with many boards in the US and in the region, and all over the world, privately held and in many different contexts, family owned, you often, it's helpful to elevate the conversation to this piece of purpose. What are we here to do? How independent is our board? How strong is our board? What kind of board do we need, and how big do we need that board to be in order to help it fulfill its role? So purpose is a big word, and that's that's one level. At the more practical level, we often talk about the role of the board as well. So what is it set up to do? And therefore, that will help you understand and dictate what sort of things are discussed, what decisions are made, and what the difference and accountabilities are between independent directors and chair, and the executive and the CEO, which is clearly at the heart of any effective board, as we've just seen in the poll, and we know from our experience. So we found this model helpful. It's, as you can see on the page, the level of independence of the board is the kind of conversation we typically have with chairs and with executives. On the far right, you see a very strong independent board, which might be on the larger side, 10 to 15 members, quite a large number of independent directors, organizations like Google, Starbucks, big global organizations, who typically need that level of independence and scale of board because they are working across multiple markets. They might have multiple products, services, be in all sorts of different geographies and regulatory environments, and therefore need a strong independent board able to hold the executive to account with a lot of different skills, capabilities, geographies, and competencies reflected on that board. So that's on the far right-hand side of the page, as you can see. And I won't go through each piece, but on the far left, perhaps maybe more government-owned, or with a strong owner on a board. There might be what we've called a subsidiary board, where there's a smaller board, which is really in some ways an extension of the entity that's perhaps owning or has established this organization, where still the executives are having much more of a stronger voice, and the independent directors are there to to support and to be helpful, but much less strong in terms of actual governance and actual decision making. We've got some examples from the global arena, but also some of the region that I know, Marcus, you were going to bring to life here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see examples, well-known brand names within the region that we have picked here. And I think what's important to say is that, except for me, that the really large scales, I mean, we have Saudi Aramco here, we have SABIC here, STC. Oftentimes, this is also a life cycle question. In particular, organization, Qiddiya, or the Reti development company, I'm sure projects most of you, all of you will be familiar with. It's maybe in an advisory board stage for a certain amount of time in a very startup, and then moving on into either a control board or a more independent board over time. It also depends to a certain extent on the, I would say, on the preference of the shareholders. Sometimes you get shareholders that have a very strong preference to be in a very controlling, operate boards in a very controlling way. Other shareholders that we see give a lot of independence and have fairly independent board directors as well, even if they're, for example, family-owned companies. So we see really a very wide variety in the region. What we can see in general, maybe slightly different from what we see globally, is that due to the structure of family-owned conglomerates here in the region that are more prevalent than, let's say, in the US or the European markets, we probably have a stronger shareholder influence, stronger chairman influence, and therefore the structure that we see is often dependent very strongly on the structure, on the shareholdership. Just two questions that came in very quickly. Yes, we will share the slides of the presentation. So sorry, I forgot to mention that. Very frequently asked question. Then a really interesting one from Robert. What's the best practice balancing presentation in board meetings by the CEO management versus giving the opportunity for true debate and input from directors? Alice, would you like to give your perspective on present versus discuss?
Yes, I mean, it's a very common, we do a lot of work in board review, board effectiveness, and you know, that's the piece of work that I lead globally and spend most of my time in. And this issue is very frequently raised when we are observing boards and giving feedback to boards. And I think typically we're always having to guide boards to have more open time, more conversation, more questioning, more digging deep, and much less presentation time. Much less, you know, re-presenting or re-sharing documents that may have gone out in pre-read or that may already be known or understood by the board. So typically, I would say in terms of best practice, it's much less presentation and much more discussion, questioning and debate in the round. That's what boards, I think, struggle with and need to do more of. Even boards where it goes straight to discussion, it's quite often the chair you know, taking questions from each of the board members and then closing. And we're typically trying to move boards into more, you know, debate, so you can get really to root causes and really to effective decision making to drive the performance of the organisation. Marcus, what would you add in region or anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think key to this is also the level of preparation. So a lot of the presentation time can be cut if materials are circled well in advance and are most importantly read by the board members, which is oftentimes one of the biggest challenges in terms of effectiveness that boards are facing. And yeah, I've been here in the region for 15 years. That's clearly it's a trend, I would say, in general, globally, but also in the region, that many people have multiple board memberships, so they become really busy, and then the preparation or reading the board materials up front is not always happening. And then it leads to a lot more presentation requirements. So make sure this is under control. And then, I mean, without quantifying it too much, but this should maybe be a 70-30 or 80-20 presentation time versus, discussion time versus presentation time ratio.
Very good. So shall I move us on then? We wanted to also share for each of these topics some examples and case studies. This is a US organisation, retail organisation, where we did a board review recently. And as Marcus said, it's often very much a life cycle question, but this was an organisation where there's a strong family and you know, founder-led board. And doing the board review, we saw various elements here on the page. You can see some commentary from the interviews on the left, some data from our online survey on the right of the screen, where you can see alignment and misalignment between different component parts of the board. And we find this is, you know, super helpful to understand some of these dynamics questions. But you know, the key message here is at this organisation, you know, growing fast, growing up to the sort of life cycle point. Needing playing much more on a global stage, retail, you know, challenged with, you know, huge shifts in consumer behaviours, you know, digital transformation massively sped up by the coronavirus pandemic. So the organisation was facing you know, a much different future, if you think about it, sort of 3 to 5 year transformation plan than it had from the past sort of 5 or 10 years of its existence. So there's a real tipping point, a real moment in time where this board was not serving the organisation well, not serving the stakeholders and shareholders well. It was serving well, but not well enough perhaps. And there was a sense that there was a need for a different type of conversation happening in the board. So some of this data here we found, at the bottom you can see 100% of executives said they would like to have more input from the board. And on the data side, you can see the real gap, or the very low scores from the chief executive compared to the independent directors, about the input of the board and the quality of the board. And you can see questions there about sufficient contributions, the extent and the balance between presentations and debate, given the question we just have had. That's quite an interesting one, that people can have very different views on what the right balance is in the boardroom, and that can be driving some less than helpful dynamics. So just to give you a sense of an organisation, a moment in time, playing back some thoughts and findings to actually surface some real misalignment and therefore drive change and improve dynamics in this particular boardroom, which is what went on to happen. Some proper conversations in that board, and in fact some refreshment of the independent directors to strengthen that board. Marcus, any cases or examples from the region you'd want to add to this?
I think in general, what we see is, and I'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about the role of the chairman, but we see a fair bit of boards that are dominated by chairman conversations, and that leads then to the lack of challenge, the lack of disagreement, as well as the lack of feedback that is provided within the board. So I would say it's a very similar scenario here as well, in terms of the perception of the individuals. And I'll bring a case study a little bit later about the chairman that I'm currently working with.
Okay.
But yeah.
Fair enough. Good. So that's really all we had on purpose and role, just the 2 pages to give you a sense of what we mean by it, and an example of where there can be a bit of a lack of alignment and what can happen next. So I think next we will open it up and we've got a short poll just to get your reactions, and we can have a look at any questions that are coming in. Please do put them on chat. So Vandana, could you run the poll, which really is 2 questions to get your sense of, do you think you have clearly, is the purpose and role clear on the board you serve on? We've heard most of you are long-term sitting board members, and how aligned do you think the key stakeholders are on your board on this purpose and role? It'd be great to get your reactions. Thank you. See the numbers creeping up. That looks good. Let it run a few more seconds. Okay, so that's run for about a minute, so good, thank you. So looks like a real spread, but predominantly on the positive side, which is good. So there's looks like most of you do have an articulated purpose and role, some in the neutral, but not so many in the disagreeing space, and sometimes alignment. So there's clearly some room for improvement here as well. Thank you for participating in that. Marcus, any questions coming in?
Yeah, there was an interesting question, 2 questions here. First of all, on slide 11, where we're looking at the archetypes, subsidiary board, advisory board, controlled and independent board, descriptions of various boards composition in the study. I think that these are terminologies that we have used to group together different types of boards that we see. So it is basically a way of categorizing different boards into a framework, so that we can also make sure that boards understand roughly where they are sitting and what kind of where they are in terms of the life cycle of their own board development, I would say. I hope that answered your question, Ehsan. I was not quite sure where this was heading. Another question here. This will come in the next chapter. Based on your experience, do we have significant gender diversity on board of GCC firms? But I think I can give an easy answer. By no means. I think latest data from the BDI shows about 4% of board members are female across the GCC. So we are not anywhere near gender diversity here in this part of the world. There are new regulations in place now. Most stock exchanges of a listed board, it becomes mandatory now to have 10 to 20% of their population on the board being female, but we are still far away from anything like a balanced perspective here.
Okay, shall we move on? Perfect, thank you, Marcus. So the second section we have here is about board composition, and we'll spend a little bit of time here. And again, going back to our original model, clearly having the right, capabilities, diversity, points of view, leadership behaviors and styles, experience, all of these things are clearly hugely important in terms of a well-functioning board and driving the dynamics on the board. So again, we wanted to share a few thoughts of how we think about this, and a case or two where we've seen this be brought to life in our clients. So board composition, we tend to think about this in these three ways, and challenge ourselves and our clients to think about this when pulling a board together or thinking about a board in the round. So ensuring that that board in its entirety has the right balance and mix of these three components. So clearly pivotal experience, so the things that you really need to have on this board in terms of capabilities, sitting executives, number of years, clearly those are things that are quantifiable and needed when you're trying to think about a board and what it needs to do. In addition to that, we'll add in the leadership capabilities. So as well as experience and things that someone has done in their previous roles and lives, how does this leader show up? How is their commercial acumen? How is their various capabilities that they might have learned in terms of their leadership style, their behaviors, and how they will be on a board? And then finally, the piece about leadership potential. What will their culture fit be on this board? Will they be the same as the individuals on the board already? Will they add something? Will they disrupt and challenge? And that might be what is needed on the board. So, we look at these three things in the round, both for individual search when we're looking for individual board members, but also thinking about board member composition and board review and board effectiveness, and even establishing new boards from scratch, which we have also been involved with globally and in the region. And then one case or two, one global case that's one of the clients that I've worked with, and how it looks and how it works. So before we get into sort of individual names or people, there's always strong personalities when it comes to boards. The existing chair, the history of the board, the people who've been on it for a long time versus the newer members. Try to sort of park that those dynamics and think about this in a sort of fact-based way. What are the capabilities that we need? And these may be present in 8 people. There's 8 topics here. They may be present in a smaller or larger number. Some of these might have nuances and sub elements that we might want to think about. But this is an example from a global retailer where we took a step back from the board as it was and thought, what does this board need for its future strength, for its future success, and delivery of its strategy for the longer term. And these were the components of the capabilities and composition that we thought would make a strong, well-functioning board. So there's not only the enablers at the top, which are the strategic enablers. There's also the foundational capabilities you can see at the bottom, clearly financial capabilities, but also those pieces about diversity that Marcus, I know, will touch on, particularly for the region, that will bring good and strong dynamics. And also what they didn't have was a sitting chief executive from another organization, which is also something that we find brings good dynamics to a board, where the CEO can really turn to that sitting executive for advice, for insights of how things have been going in their organization, and that can bring another strong lens that can improve the dynamics on the board. Marcus, did you want to add in here, or shall I go on to the next?
Yeah, I think some interesting questions coming in regarding balance of boards. Let me start with the one from Hannah here. From our point of view, what's the most challenging aspect of bringing more women on boards in the region? And then she says, we have witnessed some have joined controlled boards, but are hardly in the independent boards. I would say a number of factors that play a role here. One, in general, female participation in the workforce, historically speaking. So the pool of qualified female board members is just a smaller one, relative to the pool of qualified male board members at this point in time. Also, the female population is catching up very, very quickly, and we are very pleased to see this. I think there's a certain cultural element to it as well, making sure that we build an understanding across the region, and there are a number of initiatives from Pathway to Aurora 50 and others that are heavily promoting 50% board membership of female board members. So it's a cultural element. I mean, I give you an example of a board I work with currently, and that's in Dubai, where the board members were really proud to welcome their first female board member on their board. And there was a feeling of, oh, now we have diversity. So I can bring them board and back into reality. It says, okay, this is 1 out of 11 now. What do we do for the future? And there was a debate evolving. It's like, okay, where do we need to go? So it wasn't obvious that we should have not 1, but 2, 3, 4, 5 female board members to talk about diversity rather than 1 in the mix here. So there's a cultural dynamic. As I said, there's a pool of knowledge dynamic. And in certain industries, I think it's also more challenging than in others. And we clearly see more female participation, let's say, the consumer goods industry than we would see in energy, for example. And that's also part of where the client base comes from. And I will speak to that a little bit later. One interesting question here, Alain, maybe I loop you in on this one. Is it recommended for the management team to set up corporate governance structure and processes, i.e. conflict of interest, board of directors role includes supervising management? So what's the management team's job in asking the board to actually establish proper governance?
That would inevitably lead to conflict of interest. I mean, we must separate clearly the executive from the non-executive. I mean, the only thing that must be looked after is how the board deal with the CEO. But I mean, the management team should never ever be informed in the corporate governance.
Very, very, very true. Another question: what would be the tenure of a board member? Alice, what would you say? Ideal tenure of a board member, very important when it comes to board composition. How often do you refresh? You're on mute, Alice.
Yeah, sorry, I was just looking to read the question because I didn't actually see it. But I mean, the tenure question is different in different regions. There's different governance from different stock exchanges and different regulatory environments. So in the UK, it's a 9-year rule, and you can only be on a listed board for that amount of time. So that's a kind of straight answer. I know that's not true, and that's not the same across the world. So what we typically say is, we have a point of view on board refreshment, and an ongoing discussion in the board, that typically the nominations and governance committee would be leading under the chair's guidance, which is thinking always about the strategic situation of the organisation, and is the board doing the work it needs to do, as per the previous sort of cases and stories. And so therefore there should be a kind of constant view of the right time to refresh the board, balanced with the need for stability and the need for that board to understand the executive and the organisation that it's serving. But that view of the existing board members, the requirements of the local, regional stock exchange or entities, that are surrounding the organisation, and then the view of the chair on whether the board is serving the needs of the organisation, I think would shape that answer. I don't think there's a single straight number of years answer.
Yeah, I think just an extension of question Rita has asked, some board members have been in their seats for 50 years. Is this healthy? I don't think so. I think a very extreme example, but I'm not surprised. I have actually worked with an organization where the board member was 67 years in his seat as the chairman. So that's the record I've seen in the region so far. What should be done to replace them? Proper board succession planning is part of the board's responsibility. The chairman, the board members themselves, the NRC, there's work to be done. I know this is not something that gets a lot of attention in this part of the world, but clearly making sure there is succession planning in place in in a healthy rhythm. Is it like a 5-year, 7-year, 5, 8, 9 years? It's that in the UK it's 9 years. I believe in some countries they are 5-year, 10 years. So something along those lines. But it's always, no matter what the duration is and the tenure is, having good succession planning in place is essential.
Just to bounce back on what Alice said, most regulators in the world would consider that after 3 mandates, so most of the time 9 years, you are no longer independent. So that's why the 3 mandates is most of the time the maximum you can have.
Thank you, Alain. Marcus, shall we move on?
Yeah, there's one more question. I'll just take this one about board diversity. To get real diversity, it's important to have different views and backgrounds, and not just counting females and male ethnicity. Absolutely, I think it's key to look beyond the effect of gender or beyond ethnicity. In an ideal world, of course, we would have both elements combined together. So if you look for a specific skill set and you look for diversity when it comes to gender or ethnicity, then look for a board member that meets all of these criteria in an ideal world. And often that is quite possible. When we look at problem with your criteria set out on previous slides is that you end up hiring clones if you are not careful. Yeah. Absolutely true. And one of the biggest challenges that we see, board members or especially chairmen, they do recruit other board members that have similar thought process than themselves. So making sure that there's this diversity of experience is also part of people who are advising the boards. It's part of the independent directors that are coming on the board. And I can give you an example. I mean, I work with a large-scale industrial conglomerate in the GCC at the moment and their board. And it's very homogeneous, exactly what you are mentioning here, Robert, as the problem. There's not much diversity in thinking on the board members. And they brought in one independent director who is challenging the board, who's very diverse in his thought process, who's challenging the other board members constantly on all their decision making. And there was a complete breath of fresh air. For 1 year, they've worked with him now. And I think it was a complete door opener to a different world of board dynamics and board effectiveness now. So, you know, small changes here coming from a different pool. And this was an individual, so that the board has, it's only male, and it has 9 members, 8 members from Saudi. And now they decided to bring someone in who is from Europe, long-standing board experience in and outside the region, and has just, you know, brought a complete structural change to how decision-making is happening. So sometimes these small triggers can have a big impact on boards.
So just you know, to close out this section then on the composition part, we wanted to share one more case. This is the one that Marcus and I worked on together in the region. A new entity being established, and our support thinking with them, with that entity, about how this board should be set up to be healthy and have strong board dynamics. So as we've touched on already, there's a balance of capabilities. There's clearly the balance of global versus local, and here there was a view of having three board members from outside the region, particularly because this organization wanted to have experience and capabilities of these things in a global context. So digital tech infrastructure and some of the services elements of this organization were helpful for these board members to have experienced that on the global stage. So there was a conversation about global, local, and also how to populate then the various committees and think about how the board could be composed to be balanced and make sure the right conversations would happen in this boardroom. And then Marcus, did you want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because this is actually an example from the region, an organization that we have worked with over the last 6 months. And you can see there was a very, very deliberate decision for diversity when it comes to local versus global, when it comes to shareholder, so to say, representative versus independent directors, and the different skills and capabilities that we have seen on the previous slide. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a rare case where there would be such a deliberate effort being taken of an organization in the region to design kind of an ideal board. I also have to say this is a new organization, so there is an opportunity to bring new thinking in. When you have 70, 80 years of legacy and a very strong, dominated by shareholder representation board, then it's much more difficult to achieve an ideal mix, I would say. But it was very refreshing to see, you know, that a large-scale semi-governmental organization, you know, goes down the line of really drafting an ideal board, not caring about, or caring a lot, however you want to see it, gender and ethnicity and where people are coming from, to bring all these perspectives in. But really, what I meant by not caring about localization, but caring about bringing the right mix of capabilities. And some of it maybe cannot be found locally, and that's why there is a great opportunity here.
Very good. So let's move to the next poll. We have 2 questions for you again. If we could launch the poll. The first one, if you think of the board you're sitting on currently or you've worked with most recently, how well would you agree with the statement it has the critical capabilities it needs to succeed? And then the second question, as before, you know, how aligned is the view of the critical stakeholders in this board on that view of the capabilities? So we'll get your answers, please. Thank you. I can see participation happening. Thank you. And any more questions in chat, as we've been doing, we'll answer them as we go. Let it run a few more seconds. All right, that's probably enough. Thank you very much. Okay, so most of you agreeing that you have the critical capabilities, but still 18% disagreeing. Some strongly disagrees there at the bottom, and sometimes aligned. So perhaps a bit less clear on the alignment question there. Thank you for that. Right, so Marcus, I think I'm handing over to you to lead us through.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating to see in terms of the critical capabilities, you know, because I mean, obviously, you know, our organization, we work across the advisory space as well as the executive recruiting space. And looking especially at the first element, the critical capabilities, I mean, this is a question that we get day in, day out. And oftentimes it's the board also asking, what are the critical capabilities that we need? I think there's a recognition, oftentimes we don't know what we don't know. And when we work with boards, there are more and more boards factoring that in as well. So having the idea of what do other countries do? I'm not saying that there's always a best practice out there. Oftentimes it's a best fit decision for the organization and for the board. But in general, we can see that there's a trend of really trying to understand what's happening out there. We're in a position between pretty much on the neutral side. And honestly, between agree, neutral, and disagree, if I take the average here, maybe slightly towards the agree, but at large, we're probably in the middle. And we should be on the agreement side. You know, if you want to run an effective board and have the right capabilities for the future, then we should be substantially higher here. So while the result is not terribly bad, it's clearly not encouraging either. In terms of where we are right now, also for the same one, sometimes in terms of how aligned the stakeholders are, and it matches with our experience. Again, there's no surprise here from the region. When we look at boards here that we work with, I would have also said probably neutral is the most fair comment here. Thank you, Alice. So let's move on and talk a bit more about board dynamics itself. So how do team members work with each other? How does it work as the sum of its parts and people coming together? Another quote from a chairman we're working with: an effective board is like an orchestra. You want different instruments put together, make not a discordant but harmonious noise, but also, and he said that in the second sentence, not too harmonious. So what we see here And what we want to see from a board is healthy disagreement. The boards that are too much more of the same and just nodding things off are in almost all cases not the ones that are really effective and that are preparing the organization for the future. So this healthy discussion, healthy disagreement is good. But at the same time, if you have a disruptive board because it's just living on opposing views, it's also not the right way to go about it. So striking the balance is what we are looking for. Before I go into the next slide here, a question has come up: when a company has only executive directors as members of the board, no independent directors, how the change towards independence can take place? Yeah, that's a very good question. Alice or Alain, anything from your experience? If we have only executive directors as members of the board and no independent directors, how do we make change happen?
First, you have, and Alice would know better than I do, but you have the pressure from the regulator. Okay, so that's number one. It's very clear in most countries. If you don't have the regulator to back you up, I mean, the stakeholder will do it. Probably the investors, the bankers would put pressure on your board.
Yeah, regulators play a big role. Alice?
Well, I must say I've never seen that particular instance, but the way we've moved boards to the stronger and more independent board, part of that spectrum is to sort of hold up the mirror to what's happening and what's needed and what's going on, and as you say, try and find the influencing stakeholder, whether it's whether one of the executives could help make that debate and that change come to life, whether it's a regulator or other stakeholders around the organization. But there's a reason why an organization might want to move there, and it's typically it's better for the organization and the shareholders and stakeholders and everyone around that entity. So it's about shining a bit of a light on that story and making that come to life. I mean, other ways we've done it is we have we do introduce boards to other boards. You can executives or teams quite often will do something if a competitor's doing it or someone else that they respect is doing it. So that's another way to kind of influence and change sometimes, is to share stories or introduce people to each other where they're doing something differently and get a bit more of a sense of why that is and what benefit it's bringing to the overall performance of the company.
Absolutely. Just one more question here before we dive in. With recent improvements in communication and online meeting, do you still see value in an executive committee? I guess you're referring to the last slide that we were showing, the executive committee. Look, the executive committee is not something we see on all boards. It's in this particular instance, the reason why it was designed was because the permanent board members, a number of these were, I always call them very senior dignitaries. So individuals that are either, in this case, members of the royal family, or in other cases, globally speaking, high-ranking politicians or someone like that, which is very, very difficult to get hold of. And the number of board meetings and the time spent on board is therefore very, very limited. Hence, it was decided to run an executive committee as kind of a bit of a mini board to kind of prepare decision making before it goes to the actual board. So this was very situational, but in principle, the executive committee is not necessarily something that we see on all boards or very frequently. And another question, to what extent the role of independent non-executive directors has been made mandatory in the jurisdictions you cover? Good question from Mark. Alice, what do we see globally in terms of mandatory independent NEDs?
Well, I'd have to refer to my my colleagues probably to get a proper full answer, but every region that I work in, it is mandatory or highly recommended. I think I work mainly, do work in the region with Marcus and colleagues, but mainly Northern Europe, US, APAC, those countries. It is either mandatory or very strongly recommended by the stock exchanges or regulators in order to have independence and checks and balances in these organizations.
Alain, you would know more about Asia. How about Singapore and the Asian region? Yes, mandatory most of the time. Now the discussion are more around what percentage do we choose. In some countries, it could be as high as 80%, could be down to 2/3. But now it's mandatory in most markets. Yeah. We see. I think it's a trend to increase.
globally. Some mature markets obviously have it had for a long time. In the region, it's up and coming. The same with resolutions on board diversity and minimum percentages of female board members. So definitely something on the radar pretty much for all regulators, if it's not already in place. Very good. We move on, Alice. Let's talk a bit about improving board dynamics. What do we see as components that have a major impact on board dynamics? And we put together 5 different blocks here that we see have a big impact on board dynamics. And as you said, it's more than the sum of its parts. If board dynamics are not working because of certain individuals or certain processes falling short, then it has massive impact on the board overall. At the same time, if board dynamics are working together beautifully, you have a multiplier effect clearly in there. Role of the chairman, and it's particularly and deliberately on top of the list here, because I would say it's probably one of the most important elements when it comes to board dynamics. How does the chair manage the board? And we have a lot of examples where you find good chairmen. At the same time, unfortunately, we have also a lot of examples where there is a very, very dominant chairman. And sometimes this can be based on I mentioned this before, on the shareholdership structure. So if there is a majority shareholder who is also the chairman of the board, then of course it is a more dominating role per se. And oftentimes this leads to the board members just nodding decisions off that are often taken, without even consulting the board. It's more in a presentation mode. So we see that. So there's a big risk in there. But even other structures, currently work with a stock listed company in the GCC, where we did a board evaluation for multiple years, and there's a very dominating chairman that really is, I would say, the main decision maker on the board, and the board is more informed, maybe consulted, but more informed than anything. And despite the feedback, and that's what I said before, sometimes people don't know what they don't know. But in this case, despite the feedback that has been provided, there's no behavioral change visible. So then we come back to the question of, what's the rotation and how can the feedback be provided also to the shareholders. But clearly, very, very important, the role of the chair to make sure that there's buy-in from everybody. We spoke a fair bit about diversity on the board. It's proven that diverse independent boards are providing that better thought process and providing better dynamics of discussion on the board. I mentioned the example of just one independent director, for example, coming into a very homogeneous board, made a huge difference of how the entire board was operating, how I would say the structure of decision making was there. Not that he would influence the decision making process in most cases, but would clearly engage the other board members in a discussion as much as he could potentially do. So if there were like 3 or 4 people like that, and there was a greater diversity in terms of skill sets, independence, as you said, gender, and all the other components of diversity, then we would have probably seen a very different board and operating mechanism of the board. Maybe an interesting example as well here, we see, and I mentioned this before, different industries have sometimes different board representation. I think that's a very good point, because I work with the consumer goods industry at the moment, company, and it's an almost balanced board. So I think we have 6 men and 4 women on the board. So it's pretty balanced, because they have looked at their client portfolio and they said, okay, who is actually taking the buying decision on our product? And market research shows them that 80% of buying decisions for their products are taken by women. So maybe at some point there will be a predominantly female board in this organization, but we can see the trend towards understanding, well, we are deciding, and years ago it used to be 100% male-dominated board. So basically an all-male board was deciding client purchasing process that is 80% decided by women. So there's definitely a thought process that we see more and more in the region. Also, who is our client base? Where do we operate? On the other hand, I work with a large-scale industrial conglomerate at the moment, and their workforce, their buyers, there in general, organization is very male dominated. So the board is also a lot more male dominated, where diversity does not mean bringing necessarily more women on the board, but diversity means, well, let's think about geography. Let's think about, young versus old. Are we missing out on digital elements, for example, that are up and coming, and get some digital natives on the board? Yes, they don't have 20 years of board experience, but they bring new perspectives into this. So board diversity is very important. Strong core governance processes. So what is it that organizations want to do when it comes to governance, and clearly has a big impact also on the outcomes when it comes to board dynamics. And finally, the last two, conflict management and inclusive culture. Some of you might have read, if not, great recommendation, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Patrick Lencioni, one of the standard business books for team dynamics. And when you see that the pyramid, it's built on culture, trust. So the absence of trust and the fear of conflict are the two main prevalent dysfunctions of a team. So if you have those two in place, meaning you have a trusted culture on the board and you have a disciplined way of managing conflict, then you're usually doing well in your board dynamics and you have effective way of operating your board. Before I continue, a few questions are coming in on this one. If you're on a board where the chair is very dominating, have you any tips on how to deal with this situation? Let me give an example, and then maybe Alice or Allah, you can also, I see both of you smiling, you can also pitch in. From my perspective, there are very multiple ways, but what I found working effectively for myself is, first of all, as an advisor, I often have the liberty to be very transparent, or in pretty much all cases, very transparent with the chairman. So open feedback, making sure that the chairman really understands that he or she is very dominating, and trying to get some coaching for the chairman. A lot of chairmen nowadays also do have coaches, or are at least not opposed to potentially having a coaching relationship or starting a coaching relationship. It's very, very important. If all that doesn't help, clearly a way to get to the chairman is through the shareholders. So if you feel that this is a completely unsustainable element in there, then there's also the opportunity to say, look, we need to inform the shareholders this is not working. This chairman has substantial flaws. But Alice, any other tips here?
Okay, go ahead, Alice.
No, you go, Adam, you go.
It's the board meeting, it's just a result of other meetings. Board members must absolutely see each other in between. Okay, they have to build up trust. You cannot just pop up at a board meeting every 2 months or every month. So there is actually a lot of work done outside the boardroom. And your question is clearly one that should be dealt outside the boardroom. Okay, so you always have the vice chair, or you have the most senior guy who would be in charge of discussing every matter with the chair.
Very good, very good. So I think, Marcus, just to that question, I see one also about top tools for board dynamics. That's speaking to that maybe. So one thing I've seen with dominant chairs is feedback, clearly, and you've touched on that, Marcus, and as well, whether it's informally or formally. Clearly the chair should get some feedback at some point, either through a structured board review, an independent a view of the board members and how they are showing up in the board. That's one way to do it. And I was also going to say the relationship building that Alain was mentioning. If you need to invest time in that trust, clearly, and that relationship and that dynamic, so the feedback can be given and landed well. On a bigger scale, I've worked with the board in the US where the chair was very dominant and had been sitting on the board far too long and was not listening to the messages that he needed to make way for someone else to be chair. And in that situation, we used the non-gov committee again to shine a light on the same question I was talking about earlier. What is the capabilities? What is the leadership? What is the type of board we need. And once you share that in that committee and with the full board, actually it becomes very difficult for someone to continue being, you know, very dominant and not making way.
Yeah. There's also questions coming in around where do we find independent board directors for a circle of contact or professional headhunters? I mean, we see both, obviously, but we have seen in the past, I would say, more the first circle of contact, but gradually evolving more into professional global searches, especially because many boards are looking to bring in board members from outside the region. Maybe 2 or 3 questions regarding corporate governance. One was about the difference between regulated and family businesses, very frequently asked. I mean, in general, many family businesses are moving towards stronger governance that is in line or similar to what we see with stock-listed entities, also depending very much on the size, because corporate governance can become quite costly if you go to the same extent as some large-scale organizations, and some family organizations might not want to do this. There's still more confidentiality, you know, we're asking about different narrative here, because you're not posting your results, you're not posting the directors or the CEO's compensation and all these kinds of disclosure elements. So you can have a kind of a middle ground between becoming more transparent and more open, having more disclosure, but not going to the same extent as you would see in others. And also on the board secretary side, what is the role of the board secretary other than making resolutions, preparations, and minutes of the meeting? I mean, these are the core elements that you mentioned here. If there's a very mature board secretary, you know, might also be a bit of a mediator sometimes. We have seen board secretaries that are very strong in facilitating discussions, of course, not influencing the decision making, but at least being a facilitator within the organization. Let me just see any other questions here. The contradiction, okay, in the region, a style of challenge is important, as robust debate might be construed as lack of respect. Yeah, I think very nicely mentioned here. There are cultural differences. It's quite fascinating to see. I do a lot of work in India, I do a lot of work in Asia, as well as obviously in the Middle East where I am based. And the style of discussion varies hugely. So sometimes, even with the best intent of bringing different board members into the boards, you have this cultural bias where some cultures are naturally geared more towards more aggressive, and I say this in a now positive context as well, discussion style, versus someone that would be more hierarchical in the way they operate. So finding the right balance here, and therefore having, again, this diversity on the board that we discussed is very, very important. And finally, what level of pre-engagement with board members do you recommend ahead of board meetings? Pre-engagement with board members, so I think this is towards the question is asked towards the preparation that you have. I mean, typically there should be, of course, you know, proper agenda setting, proper information sharing. Typically a few days in advance, you share whatever it is the balance sheet or the strategic documents that need to be discussed. And then oftentimes there is interaction between the board members. It's a bit, from my experience, a bit of a double-edged sword to give a recommendation here. If there is too much pre-engagement with board members, it can happen that, you know, that the discussion at the board meeting becomes kind of obsolete and people come with preconceived ideas into the meetings. But maybe also my global colleagues, how much pre-engagement would you usually see between the board members, or is recommended?
I think it varies hugely. It depends what's happening. Listen, I think it's important, but it needs to be, you know, appropriate and done in the right way, so that there are not factions and cliques, and you know, the opportunity for proper discussion is then removed because it's been pre-done. But yeah, all the boards I've worked with, there is some level of pre-circulation and check-in that's going on around the major topics that come to the boardroom. I think it's probably only natural and helpful for you know, helpful for decision making to happen in the board. But it's a bit of a it depends answer.
Okay, so being conscious of time, I know there are other questions. I'll try to, you know, get back to some of the questions. We have only 10 minutes left. I'm going to go to 2 or 3 more points here. So
Do you want
when
me
we
to,
look at, sorry, Alice.
I thought you were going to say to click ahead. Sorry, Marcus, carry on.
Yeah, no, perfect, yeah. I think just a quick summary in terms of board dynamics. What is it that produces good board dynamics? And you can see, important to mention here on the left-hand side, we've focused on, in our framework, and it's probably similar to many others that you would have seen in terms of what we cover. But we have 16 different dimensions on how we evaluate boards, and one of them is board dynamics. So while we have spoken about this now for the last hour and a half, and we believe it's very, very important, let's make sure that we understand it's one out of many components that make a good board work. And part of it is very strongly linked to diversity and inclusion, to composition, operating mechanisms, so that there are overlaps and there's gray areas in between, clearly. But if you want to get to a high-performing board, some of the key guidelines, as we say, that we've seen working with board members, with boards, chairperson who is really a facilitator, or the lead director who creates dialogue within the organization, and enables sufficient contributions and builds all these effective working relationships with one another. So the best boards are the ones where you have really speech time for every board member that is at the board meeting. And there are lots of tools to measure that as well. So if you want to self-assess your board in terms of how the dynamics are evolving, one of the most simple but effective ways of doing it is just manage the speech time of each of the board members per board meeting. And you do this 3 or 4 times, and then you find out that some people have 20% and some people have 2%. And that's not an effective way of managing board meetings. So simple indicators like that can be very, very meaningful. The committees, we haven't spoken about committees today at all, because it's not the time for this, but also communication between the committees and the rest of the board, very, very important, alongside a clear decision-making process. We spoke about the balance between presentation and debate, and a high degree of trust. So it is clearly very important that board members trust each other and build that trust. And trust doesn't come from just sitting in board meetings with each other. Many boards nowadays, luckily, also decide to actively engage in team activities, in building trust outside the boardroom, so that when they come into the boardroom and become a working team, they really have built this trust. There are 2 or 3 interesting questions that came in. How do you spot whether constructive tension, very topical here, whether constructive tension is in fact unproductive conflict? So what's the line between productive tension and unproductive conflict?
Well, Marcus, I was wondering, in the interest of time, whether you wanted to go to the support and challenge idea to answer that question.
Yeah, we can actually do that. That's a good idea. Let's move to that one.
We'll run out of time, aren't we? This is quite interesting.
Yeah, we're running out of time. But for answering this question, if we see the 4 different zones, and we have support on the one at the bottom, and we have challenge to the left. And this is true for boards, but also for teams in general. Where are you at the moment as a team? Are you zoning out, so we're not challenging each other, but we're also not supporting each other? Or are we in a comfort zone where everything is supportive but no challenge? Or we are in an aggressive stress zone where we are challenging each other, but we're not giving support, or finally in the growth zone where we have both? I think, Peter, this is exactly where we want to be. Where the productive tension can become unproductive conflict if we're in the stress zone, but it's at the same time can be very, very constructive when we are in the growth zone. And again, there's no black or white answer to say, look, this is the indicator for which zone you are in. I think it's a mix of different elements. When we work with boards, often, for example, work as a board observer, just to give feedback after board meetings on how does this work, how do you work together as a team. So you can go down the route of having an external advisor as part of the board that coaches the board in their dynamics and how they operate with each other. But it's also the quality of decision making. If you find decisions being either taken completely harmoniously, or decisions are debated to the nth degree and never a conclusion is held, then one or the other thing is not quite right in the board. So having somewhere a middle ground on the decision making is probably something that we are looking for.
And I think that this is a tool, very simple to, Marcus, your point about share of voice in the board. This is a a conversation that boards can have and share views on, and see how aligned or misaligned people are on the experience of the board. Some of the cases I talked about earlier, some of the independent directors felt the board was in the growth zone, some of the executives felt they were in the zone out zone. There wasn't nearly enough challenge in the boardroom for their liking. So this was a helpful conversation to have, very simple. Where do you think you are on this 2x2, and where would you like to be, and why do we not agree or align? And that can surface questions of dominance or lack of from various independent or individual board members.
Yeah. So being conscious of time, we have 3 minutes left. Alice, we can go to slide 29. Just end with a few thoughts on improving board dynamics. Now, what do we see working effectively with boards? First of all, again, board purpose, board role. Is everybody clear on the big picture? Can you have an alignment session between the board and the executives? Oftentimes there's a friction between the board and the executives, so that can be a challenge as well, apart from only challenges within the board. Have clear terms of references, clear roles and responsibilities for the board and the executive team. What we see in this part of the world is that many boards act as mini executive teams. So make very sure that you have a delineation between what's the job of the board and it's not getting involved into day-to-day managerial activities. So we see a bit of too much within the GCC, definitely on that side. So drawing clear lines, I would say, is very important. We spoke a lot about board composition, and again, mix of skills and diversity of thought, and that can be gender, that can be tenure, that can be nationality, ethnicity, different experiences. So make sure you're not only pinning it to one of these dimensions, but have good diversity of thought. And then make sure that there's also development happening. A lot of board of directors are coming onto boards and they have no experience on boards or no formal development received. So it's very important that an organization can provide that. And chairman rotation should happen on a regular basis. So we recommend every 1, 2, maybe 3 years that the chairman at least rotates. Not saying that the board members couldn't remain on the board, but in general, chairman rotation, very healthy. And finally, on the board dynamics and governance, we believe a lot depends on the chairman, hence also coaching the chairman can be very important if we see deviations from good behaviors, and building an inclusive culture is also high on the chairman's agenda. The core processes must be right. So a lot of the dynamics are evolving because of bad preparation. So pre-work is really, really important. And then regular board evaluation. I think there were some questions raised also. We do a self-evaluation every year. I mean, I like self-evaluations, it's better than nothing, but really running an external review is just a lot more powerful, because the self-evaluation, we know how we see ourselves versus reality can sometimes differ. But also from one of the previous questions, how do we tell a chairman, for example, or a board member that he or she is not performing? It's just impossible to get out of a self-evaluation. Some good onboarding, very, very important. And one-on-one transition coaching. So if you move from one role to the other within the board, or if you are an executive and you're moving into the board, how can you be coached to get set up in the right possible way? Let me see if there are any final questions. No, I think in summary, Alice, if we move to the last slide. So we spoke about all of this, the summary part of its boards, diverse boards, strong governance processes, disciplined discussions, and the culture of trust. So I hope that was interesting for you. So we're making a spot landing at 3:30. I wish we would have another hour for more discussion. So thank you very much for all the questions. My apologies, we couldn't answer all of them, but we tried as much as possible. We will share through the BDI, Lucy or Vandana, I think, the deck of today's presentation. And at any point in time through the BDI, you